Hello everyone, my name is Melvin Suria, and the purpose of this video is for my senior thesis class. For our senior thesis, we wrote a paper, and the project, one of our projects was to try to convey what we wrote in our paper to a public audience. So what better way to do it than on YouTube? So I would like to make this video to explain what my thesis was about. So my thesis was about the Valladolid Debate, and the title of the paper was Aristotelian Doctrine of Cultural Racism in the Valladolid Debate. So first, I'd like to explain what was the Valladolid Debate for those who have never heard of this. So the Valladolid Debate was a debate that took place in Spain at Valladolid. And the debate was the first moral debate to discuss the rights and treatment of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So it was carried by two people. The disputation was carried out by Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda. So these two people were debating whether it was morally right for Spain to wage war against the Native Americans in order to colonize them and in order to spread the faith of Catholicism. So Bartolomé de las Casas, he was a Dominican friar, and he traveled to the Americas various times. He was a contemporary of Christopher Columbus, and he even traveled to the Americas more times than Columbus himself. At first, he followed what was called the encomienda, which was to tell the indigenous peoples of the Americas to submit to the King of Spain and to the Catholic Church. And if they did not, then they would be executed or tortured. So as he continued his ministry in the Americas, he saw the horrifying things that the Spaniards were doing with the indigenous peoples. And so, being horrified by this, he felt he needed to write an account to the King of Spain to let him know what was going on. So he wrote a book. The book is titled An Account Much Abbreviated of the Destruction of the Indies. So he wrote this to the King of Spain, and it basically depicts what he witnessed. He talks about horrifying things, such as Native Americans being butchered. Literally, their hands and their feet, their ears, their noses were chopped off. He also talks about them opening pregnant women and taking out the baby and butchering the baby, grabbing babies by their feet and dashing them on rocks. So, being horrified by this, he felt he needed to write to the King of Spain what was happening. I was actually very horrified by reading this book because it wasn't a fictional book. It was something he witnessed. So it was really scary. However, his opponent, which was Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, he was a scholar and a theologian and a philosopher. He was well educated, and he wanted to make a case for why it was justified to make war against the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So he wrote a book opposing Las Casas' view, which was called Democratis Secundus. So here's the Spanish version of it. It says, Democratis Segundo de las justas causas de la guerra contra los indios, which would translate to Democratis Secundus, the just causes for making war against the Indians. So in this book, he tries to claim why it was justified for the Spaniards to make war against the Indians. Now, the Valladolid debate that took place wasn't a debate in the modern sense. For example, when we think of a debate nowadays, we think that there will be two people or two parties arguing something at the same time, going back and forth between the argument, like the presidential debate. But we know that sometimes that kind of debate doesn't go too well. If you remember the 2020 debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. If you don't, here it is.
people out there need help.
But why didn't you do it over the last 25 years?
Because you weren't president. Because you weren't president screwing things up.
You were a senator. And
You're
by
the
way,
worst
you were a
president
vice-
America has ever had.
Hey,
Come
Joe,
on.
This is a
FBI director
This
said
is a
the threat
left-wing
on
problem.
white
This is
The
radical
question-
left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
This
Who's
is
on your
so
list?
right.
Gentlemen, I think
This
we've
is
ended
so
this.
He's going to pack the
unprecedented.
court.
We have
not going to give a list.
We have ended this segment. We're going to move on to the second segment.
That was really a productive segment, wasn't it?
So we can see that debating in this way sometimes doesn't go through well. Anyways, the Valladolid debate wasn't carried out in this fashion. So I want to explain about the nature of the debate. Usually, in Spain, whenever they had a moral issue to discuss or to debate about, they would call a junta. So a junta was when scholarly people gathered together to discuss an issue. So the Valladolid debate was carried out in this way. So it looks similar to this. And there were about 14 judges. They were well studied in civil law and in theology. And so Las Casas and Sepúlveda had to make their stands in front of these 14 judges and discuss the reasons for just war against the indigenous peoples of the America. So after one person would speak, then on the next day, his opponent would come up and the 14 judges would explain to them the points made the previous day and what his refutation is against those points. And like this, day by day, they would discuss and basically debate on whether it was justified to make war against the natives. The focus of my paper was that the debate was influenced by Aristotelian philosophy. So the Catholic Church had supported the conquest. So basically, the debate was supposed to be theological, but we can see from Sepúlveda's arguments that it was not theological. There was a lot of influence of philosophy, more specifically Aristotelian philosophy. So we can see this in Sepúlveda's arguments of just war. So this is the 4 reasons why Sepúlveda said that war could be justified. The first was that a kingdom can wage war in self-defense. In other words, if a kingdom is in danger of being attacked, they can make war against whoever the attacker is in self-defense, and that war is justified. The second was the recovery of things wrongly seized and or stolen. So if a kingdom stole something that did not belong to them or something of value, or a people stole something, then you are justified to make war against them in order to retrieve what was stolen, what was taken. The third one was the punishment of injuries received. So this means that it was justified as vengeance. So if they had already caused injury to a kingdom or a people, then it was justified to make war to seek out vengeance for the injuries that were caused. And the last one is where I think the most important one. It's kind of a little bit strange. Sepúlveda claims that when those people whose natural condition is such that they ought to obey others, nonetheless resist their rule, they may be reduced to subjection by force of arms if no other path lies open. For the greatest of the philosophers, by this he means Aristotle, affirmed that this is a just war according to the law of nature. So we can see here where influence from Aristotelian philosophy had emerged in Sepúlveda's arguments. So one thing to understand is that Aristotle had become famous again during the Renaissance. So the Renaissance occurred right before the colonization period, and the Renaissance in Europe allowed classical art and classical literature to be revived. And so many of Aristotle's works were translated and spread throughout Europe. So these ideas of people being a lesser group or racial groups being classified as lower than others was explained by Aristotle. And so this had an influence on Sepúlveda's arguments. One thing I'd like to point out is that right before the Renaissance, there was a man, a theologian named Thomas Aquinas, who actually was one of the first to incorporate Aristotelian philosophy into the Catholic Church. This is why Sepúlveda, it seemed natural for him to add Aristotelian philosophy to his arguments, because the Catholic Church had accepted Aristotelian philosophy. Now, we can see from his views that they were, he was arguing for the subjection of the indigenous peoples, or to make just war against them, because they are, their natural condition is that they ought to obey others. So Aristotelian philosophy had two doctrines. One is that people are natural slaves, and the other was that we should follow the law of nature. Here is a quote from Sepúlveda's arguments. It says, "Native Americans are inferior to the Spaniards, just as children are to adults, women to men, and indeed one might even say as apes are to men." So here we can see how he lowers the indigenous people by making them seem, by being compared to animals. Lastly, in my paper, I do mention something that I think needs more research. That is that Aristotelian philosophy had also influenced Hitler in his ideology of cultural racism. So this is a quote by one of the translators, Abraham Foxman, in his introduction to Mein Kampf. He says, "The glue that Hitler used to hold these desperate themes together was an extreme form of race-oriented social Darwinism. But even this idea was not limited to the German fringes. The modern science of race had evolved with the Enlightenment, when the Aristotelian distinctions between the cultured and the barbaric races were revived, this time using terms like civilized and primitive, by posting that certain races were inherently primitive." So we can see here that he is arguing that Hitler used social Darwinism, and also because of the Enlightenment, which happened way after the colonization, Aristotelian doctrines, Aristotelian philosophy began to be revived again. And so Hitler used these Aristotelian distinctions between cultured and barbaric peoples, or civilized or primitive. So I think this needs further investigation and further research to see how Aristotelian philosophy influenced the Nazism. But I just pointed out because I thought it was interesting. So that was the point of my paper. If you have any questions or is there something you don't understand, please post it in the comments. Thank you so much.